Michael Rodriguez had always been skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured, tested, or proven in a lab. As a xenolinguist and cognitive behavioral specialist for the Terran Diplomatic Corps, he dealt in facts, patterns, and logical frameworks. So when Admiral Patricia Williams called him into her office that gray Tuesday morning in 2157, he expected another routine assignment, perhaps translating trade agreements with the Centauri merchants or mediating a mining dispute on Europa. Instead, she handed him a classified file marked with security clearances he'd never seen before. The cover simply read, Project Mindbridge, Zellerian Conflict Resolution. Dr. Rodriguez, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room, Admiral Williams began, her weathered face more serious than usual. 6 months ago, we made first contact with a species called the Zellerians. They're unlike anything we've encountered, a completely telepathic civilization from the Kepler 438 system. No spoken language, no written communication, just pure thought-to-thought transmission. Michael opened the file, scanning reports filled with terms he'd never seen in xenological studies. Psychic warfare, mental combat zones, telepathic siege tactics. His hands trembled slightly as he absorbed the implications. The problem, Admiral Williams continued, is that they're currently engaged in what can only be described as a civil war fought entirely in the realm of consciousness. Two factions, the Harmony Collective and the Individual Will Movement, have been locked in mental combat for over 3 years. Their conflict has created what our scientists are calling psychic dead zones that extend for light years around their home system. Michael looked up from the file, and this affects us how exactly? 3 of our deep space mining operations have gone dark after entering these zones. We've lost contact with over 200 personnel. When our rescue ships approach, the crews experience severe psychological symptoms, hallucinations, memory loss, complete personality changes. Some never recover. The weight of the situation began to settle on Michael's shoulders. So you want me to, what? Learn telepathy. Admiral Williams leaned forward. We want you to do what you do best, find a way to communicate, to understand their conflict, and hopefully broker some kind of peace. The twist is that you'll be working with their technology. The Zellerians have developed something they call a consciousness interface, a device that can temporarily grant telepathic abilities to non-psychic species. Michael's scientific mind raced with questions and concerns. The risks of interfacing foreign technology with human neural patterns are significant, yes. That's why you're the only volunteer we're considering. Your psychological profile shows remarkable mental resilience, and your expertise in cross-species communication makes you our best hope. Over the following weeks, Michael underwent intensive preparation at the classified Blackwater Research Facility in the Nevada desert. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the lead neuroscientist on the project, explained the consciousness interface, a crystalline device no larger than a contact lens that would be surgically implanted behind his left ear. The Zellerians call it a thought bridge, Dr. Chen explained during one of their sessions. It essentially translates human neural patterns into their telepathic frequency. Think of it as learning a new language, except instead of words and grammar, you're learning to transmit and receive pure consciousness. The testing phase proved more challenging than anyone anticipated. Michael's first attempts at telepathic communication resulted in severe migraines and disorientation. The human brain, it seemed, wasn't designed to process the volume and intensity of telepathic information that came naturally to the Zellarians. "It's like trying to drink from a fire hose," Michael reported after one particularly difficult session. "Their thoughts don't come in neat, organized sentences. It's layers upon layers of emotion, memory, intention, and meaning, all transmitted simultaneously." Dr. Sarah Martinez, the project's psychological consultant, worked with Michael to develop coping mechanisms. "Think of it as learning to filter," she suggested, "like tuning a radio to pick up specific frequencies while blocking out the static." After 6 weeks of preparation, Michael felt as ready as he could be for a mission that defied every conventional approach to diplomacy. The journey to the Zellarian system aboard the research vessel, Horizon's Edge, took 4 months through hyperspace. During the transit, he continued practicing with the consciousness interface, gradually building his tolerance for telepathic communication. Captain Robert Thompson, a veteran of first contact missions, served as Michael's military liaison. "I've been in some strange situations," Thompson admitted as they approached the Kepler 438 system. "But this is the first time I'm sending a diplomat into a war zone that exists entirely inside people's heads." As they entered the outer edge of the psychic conflict zone, the ship's crew began experiencing the reported symptoms. Navigator Jessica Park reported seeing phantom contacts on her screens. Engineer David Kim complained of hearing voices in languages that didn't exist. Even Captain Thompson, known for his steel nerves, appeared increasingly agitated. "It's starting," Michael observed, feeling the first tendrils of alien thoughts pressing against his consciousness through the interface. Unlike the controlled practice sessions, these mental contacts carried the raw emotional intensity of beings locked in existential conflict. The first clear telepathic message came as they reached the system's asteroid belt. It wasn't words or images, but a complex weaving of concepts that Michael's enhanced mind translated as something like, "Another mind-dark species ventures into the breaking place. Turn away, small thoughts, before the war-think consumes your not-connected essence." Michael activated the ship's communication array, not to send radio signals, but to broadcast his response through the consciousness interface. "I am Michael of the humans. We seek understanding, not conflict. Our people have been harmed by the Mind War's spreading effects. We wish to help bring peace." The response came from multiple sources simultaneously, a cacophony of telepathic voices representing both factions of the Zellarian conflict. Through the overwhelming mental noise, Michael began to distinguish individual perspectives and gradually piece together the nature of their civil war. The Harmony Collective believed that individual consciousness was an illusion, that all Zellarian minds should merge into a single unified entity for the greater good of their species. The individual will movement fought to preserve personal identity, and the right to maintain separate consciousness. Both sides saw the conflict as fundamental to their species' survival. What struck Michael most profoundly was the intensity of their convictions. This wasn't a political disagreement or territorial dispute. It was a battle over the very nature of existence and consciousness itself. Each side genuinely believed that accepting the other's philosophy would mean the death of everything they valued about being Zellerian. As the horizon's edge moved deeper into the system, Michael realized that his role had evolved beyond simple translation or mediation. The Zellerians were treating him as something unprecedented, a neutral consciousness, neither fully connected like themselves nor completely isolated like most other species they'd encountered. His human mind, enhanced by their technology but retaining its essential human nature, represented a third perspective they'd never considered. Michael Rodriguez had traveled to the Kepler 438 system, expecting to solve a diplomatic crisis through careful communication and cultural understanding. Instead, he found himself at the center of a philosophical revolution that would challenge everything both species thought they knew about consciousness, identity, and what it truly meant to be alive in an interconnected universe. The real work, he realized, was only just beginning. The deeper the horizon's edge ventured into Zellerian space, the more intense the psychic pressure became. Michael found himself experiencing fragments of memories that weren't his own, glimpses of vast crystalline cities where thoughts flowed like rivers between towering spires, moments of pure collective ecstasy from the Harmony faction, and fierce flashes of individual determination from the Will movement. Dr. Martinez had warned him about psychological contamination, but experiencing it firsthand proved far more disorienting than any simulation. During one particularly intense episode, Michael caught himself speaking in what he later realized were telepathic concepts that had no human equivalent, trying to verbalize ideas about shared consciousness that human language simply couldn't contain. "The interface is working too well," he reported to Captain Thompson during one of his lucid moments. "I'm not just translating their thoughts anymore. I'm starting to think like them." Captain Thompson's concern was evident even through his own battle with psychic interference effects. Can you still distinguish between your thoughts and theirs? Michael paused, realizing the question was more complex than it appeared. That's just it. I'm beginning to understand that the distinction itself might be what this whole war is about. The Harmony Collective sees individual thought as artificial separation from a greater whole. The individual will movement sees collective consciousness as the death of the self. But what if they're both partially right? As they approached the inner planets of the Zellerian system, Michael made contact with what appeared to be a neutral faction, Zellerians who had withdrawn from the conflict and established isolated communities on the system's outer moons. Through careful telepathic dialogue, he learned more about the war's origins. The conflict had begun when Zellerian scientists developed technology that could permanently link multiple consciousness into a collective network. The discovery split their society down the middle. Some saw it as the next step in evolution, while others viewed it as the ultimate violation of individual identity. What started as philosophical debate became ideological warfare, explained a Zelarian elder named Kethvar, whose thoughts carried the weight of centuries. Both sides began using forced mental integration as a weapon. The Harmony faction would absorb individual will members into their collective, claiming it was liberation. The individual will movement developed techniques to permanently sever telepathic connections, leaving Harmony members mentally isolated for the first time in their lives. The psychological trauma on both sides had been devastating. Zelarians forced into collective consciousness lost their sense of individual identity, while those cut off from telepathic connection experienced what could only be described as a form of sensory amputation. The war had become one of mutual annihilation, with each side trying to force their philosophy onto the other through increasingly extreme means. Michael realized that traditional diplomatic approaches were useless here. This wasn't about territory, resources, or political power. It was a conflict between two incompatible definitions of existence itself. Any solution would need to address the fundamental philosophical divide while providing a practical framework for coexistence. His breakthrough came during a particularly dangerous phase of the mission, when the Horizon's Edge was caught between two major psychic battle fronts. The ship's crew was experiencing severe psychological symptoms. Several officers had to be sedated after attempting to physically attack their own reflections, convinced they were enemy infiltrators. In the midst of this chaos, Michael made an unprecedented decision. Instead of trying to communicate with one faction or the other, he opened his consciousness interface to maximum sensitivity and broadcasted his thoughts to all Zelarians within range simultaneously. "I am a mind that stands between your positions," he transmitted, fighting through the overwhelming sensory input. "I carry individual thoughts, but I can touch collective consciousness. I maintain my identity, but I can share in your unity. Perhaps the answer isn't choosing between individual and collective existence, but finding a way to honor both." The response was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time since the war began, both factions focused their attention on a single point: Michael's unprecedented hybrid consciousness. Through the interface, he could feel thousands of Zelarian minds examining his thoughts, trying to understand how he maintained coherent individual identity while remaining open to collective experience. What followed was the most intense mental exchange in recorded history. Michael found himself serving as a living bridge between two irreconcilable worldviews, his enhanced human consciousness providing a neutral ground where harmony and individual will representatives could meet without forcing either to abandon their core beliefs. The process nearly destroyed him. Human brains weren't designed to channel such massive telepathic exchanges, and Michael began experiencing severe neurological symptoms, seizures, temporary paralysis, and moments where he completely lost track of which thoughts were his own. Dr. Martinez worked around the clock to keep him stable, but it became clear that continued exposure at this intensity would be fatal. "Michael, you need to pull back," she urged during one of his brief conscious moments. "The neural stress is approaching critical levels." But Michael had begun to see something that neither faction had considered: a potential solution that could only emerge from his unique position as an outsider with insider access. The war wasn't really about choosing between individual and collective consciousness. It was about fear, fear of losing identity, fear of being alone, fear of change, fear of remaining static. "Give me one more session," he insisted, despite his deteriorating condition. "I think I understand what they need to hear." Captain Thompson was reluctant to approve what amounted to a potentially suicidal telepathic broadcast, but the alternative was watching the conflict consume more systems as it continued to spread outward from the Zellerian home worlds. Michael's final transmission to the Zellerian factions wasn't a diplomatic proposal or a negotiated settlement. Instead, it was something far more personal, a human perspective on consciousness, identity, and connection that challenged both sides' fundamental assumptions about existence itself. His words would either end the war or end him, and perhaps both. Michael's final telepathic broadcast began at 3:47 ship time, as the Horizon's Edge held position between two massive psychic battle formations. Dr. Martinez monitored his vital signs, while Captain Thompson stood ready to terminate the connection if his life signs became critical. Through the consciousness interface, Michael opened his mind completely, allowing both Zellerian factions to experience human consciousness in its rawest form. "I want to share something with you," he transmitted, his thoughts reaching across the light years of psychic warfare. "Where I come from, we have a concept called loneliness, the pain of being isolated from others. But we also have a concept called autonomy, the joy of being uniquely ourselves. For humans, both are necessary. We suffer when we're completely alone, but we also suffer when we lose our individual identity." Through the interface, Michael shared memories from his own life, moments of deep connection with friends and family, but also times when he needed solitude to think, to create, to simply exist as himself. He showed them human love, which required both separate identities and the desire to bridge the gap between them. The response from both factions was initially confused, then increasingly intrigued. The concept of chosen connection, maintaining individual identity while deliberately sharing experience, was foreign to their binary understanding of consciousness. "You speak of connection without absorption," came a response from the Harmony Collective. "But how can true unity exist if barriers remain between minds?" "You speak of identity without isolation," transmitted the individual will movement. "But how can authentic self exist if boundaries can be crossed at will?" Michael's answer came not in words or concepts, but in demonstration. Through the consciousness interface, he showed them how human relationships worked, the way two people could share profound intimacy while remaining distinct individuals, how groups could collaborate without losing personal identity, how communities could form without requiring complete mental merger. "Watch," he transmitted, and began sharing memories of human cooperation. A surgical team working in perfect coordination while maintaining individual expertise. A jazz ensemble where each musician contributed unique elements to create collective beauty. A family where love connected separate souls without erasing their differences. The telepathic silence that followed lasted for several minutes, an eternity in psychic communication. Michael could feel both factions processing this new paradigm, testing it against their own experience and assumptions. Then something unprecedented happened. For the first time since the war began, representatives from both sides began direct communication with each other, using Michael's consciousness as neutral ground. The Harmony faction shared their deep fear that individual identity led to isolation and suffering. The individual will movement revealed their terror that collective consciousness meant the death of everything that made life meaningful. Both of your fears are valid, Michael transmitted, drawing on his training in conflict resolution. But they're based on the assumption that you must choose between complete separation and complete unity. What if there's a middle path? Working through Michael's interface, the factions began exploring hybrid approaches they'd never considered. Could Zelarians maintain individual identity while choosing moments of collective consciousness? Could they create voluntary networks that respected personal boundaries? Could they develop new forms of connection that honored both unity and autonomy? The mental effort required to facilitate these exchanges pushed Michael beyond his physical limits. His nose began bleeding, then his ears. Dr. Martinez reported dangerous neural spike patterns, but Michael refused to break the connection. "They're so close," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can feel them finding common ground." Through the interface, he sensed a remarkable shift in the psychic battlefield around them. The violent mental clashes between factions began to subside as more Zelarians from both sides engaged in the unprecedented dialogue. Instead of forced conversion or defensive isolation, they were exploring voluntary, limited connection, maintaining individual consciousness while sharing specific experiences or emotions by choice. The breakthrough came when a Harmony collective member and an individual will representative successfully demonstrated what they termed selective unity, a temporary, consensual joining of consciousness that preserved individual identity while allowing deep connection. It was like nothing either faction had experienced before, and word of the possibility spread through telepathic networks faster than any physical communication could travel. But the effort of serving as a bridge between incompatible worldviews had pushed Michael's enhanced human brain to its breaking point. As the Zelarian factions began establishing their first peaceful contacts in 3 years, Michael collapsed on the bridge of the horizon's edge. Consciousness interface is showing critical stress patterns, Dr. Martinez reported as medical teams work to stabilize him. His neural activity is completely chaotic. I don't know if the human brain can recover from this level of telepathic strain. For 3 days, Michael remained unconscious while his mind slowly processed the massive telepathic exchange. When he finally awakened, he found that something fundamental had changed. The consciousness interface had integrated so completely with his neural patterns that removing it was no longer possible. He would remain permanently connected to Zelarian telepathic networks for the rest of his life. More significantly, reports were coming in from across the Zelarian system that the war was actually ending. Both factions had begun implementing variations of the selective unity concept, creating new forms of society that neither had imagined possible. Some Zellarians chose periods of collective consciousness while maintaining individual identity cores. Others formed voluntary networks with carefully negotiated boundaries. Many discovered that the freedom to choose connection or solitude made both experiences more meaningful. The psychic dead zones that had threatened shipping lanes were dissipating as destructive mental warfare gave way to constructive exploration of consciousness itself. The three lost mining operations were back in contact, their crews recovering from their psychological trauma with Zellarian assistance. Admiral Williams arrived on the horizon's edge 2 weeks later to personally debrief Michael and assess the mission's success. She found him changed, still recognizably human, but carrying an otherworldly awareness that came from permanent connection to an alien telepathic network. "The doctors say you'll never be completely human again," she observed during their private meeting. "Do you regret the sacrifice?" Michael considered the question carefully, feeling the constant background presence of Zellarian thoughts that had become part of his daily experience. "I didn't lose my humanity," he replied. "I expanded it. The Zellarians taught me that consciousness isn't limited to the boundaries we assume. Connection doesn't require absorption, and identity doesn't require isolation." Admiral Williams studied the man who had prevented an interstellar war through the unprecedented act of bridging incompatible forms of consciousness. "What happens now? Earth is offering you any position you want in the diplomatic corps, but I suspect you already know what you're going to choose." Michael nodded, his decision already clear. The Zellarians had requested that he remain as a permanent cultural liaison, helping both species understand the implications of their new relationship. More importantly, other telepathic species throughout the galaxy were expressing interest in the selective unity concept, and Michael's unique consciousness made him the ideal ambassador for this new form of interspecies communication. "I'm staying," he confirmed, "not just as a human representative, but as something new, a bridge consciousness that can help different species understand each other at the deepest possible level." As the horizon's edge prepared for its return journey to Earth, Michael remained behind on the Zellarian research station that had become his new home. Through the consciousness interface, he could feel the continued evolution of Zellarian society as they explored the possibilities of chosen connection and voluntary unity. The war that had once threatened to consume entire star systems had become the foundation for a new understanding of consciousness itself. And at the center of it all was a human xenolinguist who had discovered that the greatest diplomatic breakthroughs sometimes required not just understanding other species, but becoming something entirely new in the process. Michael Rodriguez watched the Earth ship disappear into hyperspace, knowing he would never return to the world of his birth. But he no longer saw this as exile. Instead, it was evolution. He had become something unprecedented in the galaxy's history, a permanent bridge between different forms of consciousness, living proof that connection and identity could coexist. In the months that followed, Michael's role expanded beyond simple cultural liaison. As news of the Zellerian peace spread through interstellar communication networks, other species facing similar consciousness-based conflicts began requesting his assistance. The Meridian Collective, a hive mind species struggling with rebellious individual units, sent diplomatic inquiries. The Solitary Ones, a race of utterly isolated beings who communicated only through complex mathematical equations, expressed curiosity about limited connection concepts. Each new contact required Michael to push the boundaries of his hybrid consciousness further. The permanent interface with Zellerian telepathy had fundamentally altered his neural structure, but it had also given him unprecedented insight into the nature of consciousness itself. He began to understand that every sapient species represented a unique solution to the fundamental challenge of existence: how to be both individual and connected, separate and unified. Working with Dr. Chen via long-distance communication, Michael documented his experiences and insights. Their research began revealing patterns in consciousness evolution that had never been recognized before. Species throughout the galaxy seemed to follow predictable developmental paths, moving from isolation to connection, to complex negotiations between individual and collective identity. The Zellerian conflict, rather than being unique, represented a common evolutionary challenge that most advanced civilizations eventually faced. "You've become more than a diplomat," Dr. Chen observed during one of their quantum-encrypted video calls. "You're documenting the fundamental stages of consciousness evolution. This research could revolutionize our understanding of sapient development throughout the galaxy." Michael's unique position allowed him to perceive patterns that purely human or purely Zellerian consciousness couldn't detect. His hybrid awareness could recognize the underlying similarities between species that appeared completely different on the surface. The mathematical isolation of the Solitary Ones and the collective unity of the Meridian hive mind, he realized, were both responses to the same fundamental fear: the terror of being alone in an infinite universe. His first major success after the Zellerian peace came with the Andorian crisis. The Andorians were a species that existed as pure energy beings, capable of merging completely or existing in total separation. Their society had fractured when some members began experimenting with partial merger, existing as small groups rather than lone individuals or the traditional all-encompassing collective. The conflict had turned violent as traditional Andorians attacked the partial ones for what they saw as an abomination of proper existence. When Michael arrived in the Andorian system, he found a three-way war raging between lone individuals, partial groups, and the original collective. "Your species faces the same choice that nearly destroyed the Zellerians," Michael transmitted through specially adapted energy consciousness interfaces. "But you have an advantage. You can see the result of choosing rigid positions over flexible solutions." Working with Andorian scientists, Michael helped develop new merger protocols that allowed individuals to experiment with different levels of connection without losing the ability to return to their preferred state. The concept of consciousness flexibility, proved revolutionary for the Andorians, who had previously seen their existence options as mutually exclusive. Within 6 months, Andorian society had restructured itself around the principle of chosen connection levels. Some remained solitary, others preferred small groups, and many maintained the traditional collective experience. But all accepted that these were valid choices rather than betrayals of proper existence. The success of the Andorian mediation established Michael's reputation throughout the galaxy as someone who could resolve consciousness-based conflicts that traditional diplomacy couldn't touch. Requests for his assistance began arriving from species he'd never heard of, facing conflicts he couldn't have imagined. The crystalline minds of Vega 7 were fracturing because some members wanted to experience linear time, while others preferred their traditional simultaneous awareness of past, present, and future. The neural dancers of the Outer Rim were splitting apart because half their population wanted to maintain their shared memory banks, while others sought individual memory privacy. Each case required Michael to expand his understanding of consciousness and develop new approaches to bridging incompatible worldviews. The permanent Zelarian interface continued to evolve, adapting to each new form of alien consciousness he encountered. Dr. Martinez, monitoring his condition remotely, reported changes in his brain structure that shouldn't have been possible in any known species. "You're not just adapting to alien consciousness," she told him during one of their sessions. "You're developing new neural pathways that didn't exist in baseline human anatomy. Your brain is literally evolving to accommodate multiple forms of consciousness simultaneously." Michael could feel the changes himself. His perception of reality had become fundamentally different from his original human experience. He could simultaneously hold individual and collective perspectives, linear and non-linear time awareness, emotional and purely logical thought processes. It was as if his consciousness had become a multi-dimensional space where different forms of awareness could coexist without conflict. This evolution wasn't without cost. Sleep became irregular as his mind processed multiple consciousness states simultaneously. Dreams blended with telepathic contact, making it difficult to distinguish between his own thoughts and alien mental transmissions. Sometimes he forgot which species he was originally from, his human identity becoming just one layer in an increasingly complex consciousness matrix. But the benefits were extraordinary. Michael found himself capable of insights that no single species' consciousness could achieve. He could see solutions to conflicts that seemed impossible, because he could literally think like all parties involved simultaneously. His reports back to Earth described forms of consciousness that challenged every assumption about the nature of mind and identity. "I'm not losing my humanity," he assured Admiral Williams during one of their quantum communications. "I'm discovering what humanity can become when it's not limited by the boundaries of a single species' consciousness. The future of interspecies relations isn't going to be about translation or cultural exchange. It's going to be about consciousness evolution." The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be expanded and adapted to accommodate multiple species' perspectives simultaneously, The possibilities for galactic cooperation were unlimited. Wars based on fundamental incompatibilities between different forms of awareness could become obsolete. Trade, exploration, and cultural exchange could reach levels previously impossible when species were locked into single consciousness paradigms. But Michael also recognized the dangers. The line between consciousness expansion and consciousness dissolution was perilously thin. Each new alien awareness he integrated required careful balance to maintain some core of stable identity. Too much expansion